Everybody can hear. Great. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Good evening from Istanbul. Good morning or afternoon for those of you in different time zones. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak with you here today. I'll be talking today about the burials at Tell Atchana, Alalakh, and how bioarchaeology, specifically stable isotope and ancient DNA analyses, along with looking at the burial practices at the site, can reveal aspects of the lives and deaths of the inhabitants of the city. Using these multiple lines of evidence, we can zoom in on certain parts of their lives and get a better understanding of what those lives were like. Before I begin, I'd also like to say that the DNA and Isotope project was part of a collaboration with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History under the umbrellas of both the Max Planck Harvard Research Center for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean and the European Council project Food Transforms. And I thank all of our collaborators on both of those projects, as well as Rilla Shafiq, our bioarchaeologist and human remains specialist, who has generously shared her preliminary assessments of the ages and sexes of the skeletons with me. And of course, the Tell Atchana directors, Aslıhan Yener and Murat Akar, for their support and for the permission and ability to work on this wonderful assemblage. Tell Atchana, for those of you who may not be familiar, is located in the Amuk Valley in southeastern Anatolia. The city was a regional capital throughout the second millennium BC during the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, with a limited Iron Age occupation centered around the city's temple. The first excavations at the site were conducted by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1930s and 40s, and Aslıhan Yener restarted excavations in 2000, which continue today under the direction of Murat Akar. Politically, the site changed hands several times over the second millennium BC. The Middle Bronze II is associated with the political and cultural dominance of the Amorite kingdoms in northern Syria, followed by becoming a vassal of Mitanni and part of the Hurrian sphere in Late Bronze I. Finally, the Late Bronze II represents Hittite control of the state, after which it was mostly abandoned around 1300 BC. Throughout the sequence, there are high levels of internationalism evident at Atchana, and both material and textual evidence suggests that there was a lot of movement, not just of goods like pottery and agricultural products, but also of the people who were moving these things around. In total, 345 burials have been documented from periods 8 through 1, covering the late Middle Bronze II through the Late Bronze II. And they've been found all across the site in all excavated areas. Woolley published 151 burials from the royal precinct in the north of the mound, nicknamed for the palaces found during his excavations, and in what he called Site H on the southern flank of the mound, where he uncovered defensive and domestic architecture associated with a city gate. Woolley seems not to have published all the graves he found, however. Based on the numbering system he used in the publications of the graves, there could be as many as 200 burials that he found but did not publish. As he generally didn't mark burial locations on his published plans, and as any field notebooks he kept have not survived, this number may well prove impossible to confirm, but it's worth keeping in mind that we seem to have no records of a large number of graves he found on the mound. This also illustrates the important point that recurs again and again studying this assemblage, that we're just simply missing a lot of information about the graves that he excavated. No bioarchaeologist apparently ever examined these skeletal remains, so we're missing even the most basic age and sex data for most of them. Though Woolley does sometimes indicate rough age categories, this was presumably based on the most kind of general eyeballing of the skeleton, rather than on actual examination. The current excavations have found 194 burials, and you can see on this site map that the yellow squares are those where burials have been found. In Area 3, on the northeastern slope of the mound, the city fortification wall has been uncovered, and a dense cemetery outside the city wall has been excavated, which you see on the map here. A second cemetery area within the city's walls has been found in Area 4 in the south of the mound, And the rest of the burials are scattered throughout the excavation squares, mostly as isolated examples. In general terms, roughly 2/3 of the graves are single, simple pit burials, with individuals in both flexed and extended positions. However, looking at the corpus as a whole, there's a wide variety of grave types, including multiple burials and secondarily treated burials, along with other more minority types, such as cremations, pot burials, and several more elaborate tombs: cist graves, the rich plastered tomb, the so-called shaft grave, a chamber tomb discovered by Woolley in the level 7 Middle Bronze Palace. All ages are represented in the sample, with the unknown category here in the graph representing most of Woolley's graves, as well as highly disturbed burials in the Area 3 cemetery. Nevertheless, from the data available, we have roughly 50% adults, which is in line with estimates of what could be expected to constitute a representative archaeological sample. We also have a nearly 50-50 split between identified females and males, these generally representing adults, of course. Only about 1/3 of the assemblage has been sexed due to, of course, lack of detail about many of Woolley's burials. Despite these various uncertainties, though, we do seem to have a roughly representative sample of the population at Alalakh. So if we turn to bioarchaeology, what we're all here to discuss, I'll be looking at the isotope and DNA results specifically. These focus on information about diet, mobility, and ancestry, and have the potential to reveal differences between, for example, different social status groups, different ages or sexes, and culturally specific diets, such as food taboos, as well as patterns like migration, transhumance, and exogamy practices, and potentially the ability to link specific burial practices or grave goods to particular cultures or regions of origin. So regarding our sample, in total, we have results from 77 samples for carbon and oxygen, which were taken from teeth, 51 samples for carbon and nitrogen from bone, 53 samples for strontium, also from teeth, and 37 DNA samples taken from petrous bones, which is the bone in the inner ear. To briefly give a background on strontium isotope studies, strontium isotopes are used in archaeology, of course, primarily for mobility studies. And the method depends on determining a local isotopic signature and then comparing the human results to this local range to determine whether individuals are local or non-local. As you see illustrated here, strontium signatures in humans are derived from bedrock strontium values. Strontium originates in the bedrock and moves through the food chain, entering the human body via plants and animals and substituting for calcium during bone and tooth formation. So areas with different geologies result in different strontium signatures. For our study, we sampled tooth enamel, which forms in childhood and doesn't remodel, meaning that the results indicate where a person lived when the tooth sampled was formed. We preferentially sampled second molars, M2s, which form in childhood, roughly between the ages of 2 and 8. So the strontium isotope results here detect whether an individual grew up locally at Alalakh and spent their childhood there, or whether they arrived later. For several individuals of particular interest, we sampled to capture several different stages of life. In order to interpret the strontium results, though, we need to understand what the local strontium values are, which means taking samples, of course. Archaeological strontium studies use a variety of sample types for this, although animal bones and teeth are the most widely used. You can see from this geological map that there's a wide range of geological formations in and around the valley. And we wanted to get local baselines both for the Amuk Valley as a whole and Tell Atchana specifically, so that we could get an idea of this variation. For Atchana itself, we used 35 ancient snail and faunal samples from excavated contexts, but for the valley, we didn't have archaeological samples, so we used modern snail shells, which are easy to find in many areas. Snails aren't very mobile, obviously, and don't travel very far throughout their lives. So the results give a good idea of the strontium available in very restricted areas. This more microscale approach can obscure other types and levels of results, But our aim here was to try to get a broad picture of the biologically available strontium throughout the valley. So we analyzed 14 shells from around the valley, and you can see the locations on the map here. So the results from these ancient and modern environmental samples are shown here in black and gray on the right side of the graph. In order to calculate a local range, strontium studies typically take the mean of these environmental samples and then add and subtract 2 standard deviations. Because we have samples from both Atchana specifically and from the valley generally, we were able to calculate 2 local ranges, one for Atchana from the archaeological samples that's shown here in blue, and one for the Amuk as a whole from the modern samples shown here in gray. When we compare these ranges to the results from the humans, 40 individuals plot inside the range of Alalakh, meaning they likely both grew up and were buried in the city. And another 8 plot within the range for the Amuk Valley, but outside of the Atchana range, meaning they probably grew up outside of the city itself, but somewhere else within the valley. 5 individuals are identified as non-locals to both Alalakh and the Amuk, plotting outside both of these local ranges. As I mentioned, for several individuals, we analyzed multiple teeth to try and get a better idea of where they lived at different times of their lives. And we see a few different patterns emerge from these results. One individual, sample number ALA 110 in the circle all the way to the left of the graph, has a second molar that yielded the lowest value among the whole group. But the third molar is near the mean for Alalakh, which indicates that this person moved to the city in later childhood, between the formation of the second and third molars, so probably around 7 or 10 years old. Another individual, ALA 98, the middle one circled at the bottom here, yielded very similar values for both teeth, both of them outside the range for the Amuk. It appears then that this individual spent their entire childhood and youth somewhere else entirely, moving to Alalakh later as an adult. The rightmost circled individual, ALA 48, apparently came from the Amuk, though not Alalakh, and seems to have moved during their adolescence based on the separation in the values. This could have been to a different place in the valley, or it could have been to Alalakh itself if the move occurred while the third molar was forming, since it does fall just outside the range for Alalakh. So let's layer in the DNA results now. We can see that all the individuals sampled from Atchana, which are the green circles on this PCA here, are very homogeneous from a population genomics perspective, with only one exception. This one at the top here, off all by itself. This extreme outlier position is closest to sampled individuals from Bronze Age Iran and Central Asia. It seems, therefore, that either this individual or their recent ancestors migrated to the Alalakh region. The rest of the individuals cluster closely with those sampled from nearby Ebla from both 3rd and 2nd millennium BC contexts. These are the yellow circles on this image. Both of these groups, Atchana and Ebla, fall between contemporary Central Anatolian and Central and Southern Levantine individuals, and models of the Alalakh individuals best describe their ancestry as a combination of Anatolian, Levantine, and Iranian/Caucasian origins. The genetic homogeneity of the Atchana samples suggests that the recent ancestors of most people came from within the wider region around the Amuk Valley and Ebla. Based on the DNA results, we then went back and sampled molars from that one genetic outlier. She's been dubbed the Well Lady because her remains were found at the bottom of a deep waterlogged pit, potentially a victim of murder. Working off the initial idea that she migrated to the region from her DNA results, we sampled all 3 of her molars. And the results of all 3 fall very close to the Atchana mean and well within the local range for Alalakh, as you can see here. It seems then that the Well Lady herself did not migrate, but rather her ancestors did. The strontium evidence is consistent with her having spent her whole life at Atchana, despite her very different DNA profile. although we can't entirely rule out the possibility that she spent her childhood in a place with similar strontium signatures that wasn't Alalakh. So layering in and looking at the other isotopic results may give us some more information, both on the population generally and on some of these interesting individuals in particular. The oxygen results don't tell us much, unfortunately. Oxygen primarily enters the human body through drinking water, and its isotopic value is mainly determined by the water cycle and the ways in which oxygen moves through it, with the isotopic value changing according to variables such as elevation, temperature, and distance from the sea. The overall range of values for Atchana is 4.1 per mil, which is fairly large, but despite 2 per mil being cited in the past as the expected amount of intragroup variation, more recent research is proving in-group statistics more reliable for identifying outliers, since so many factors influence oxygen values, including things like methods of food preparation and overall diet composition. Here are the oxygen results then, and you can see that although there is a fairly wide spread, they also form a reasonably coherent group. When we look at the oxygen values of the population as a whole, there are no statistical outliers, so we can't identify any non-locals. From this data, it looks like the entire sample population was consuming isotopically similar water sources. The oxygen isotopes map here shows modern precipitation values for the region, and you can see that most of northwestern Syria has similar oxygen results to those that we see at Atchana. What this suggests is that oxygen isotopes may not be particularly useful in identifying human mobility within this area, since values are likely to be similar enough that we may not be able to identify non-locals with confidence. If we now layer in the carbon and the nitrogen results, these tell us about diet and what people were eating. Briefly, carbon isotopes can identify the plant sources of diets, and nitrogen isotopes identify the trophic level on the food chain and the contribution of meat and other animal products to human diets. There are 2 main groups of plants identifiable through carbon isotopes, which are distinguished based on the pathways carbon takes during photosynthesis, C3 and C4 plants. Most human food plants are C3, with the exception of a handful of C4 plants like maize, millet, and sorghum. But many grasses are also C4 and can influence human diets via animals who consume them. When we look at diet and the carbon isotope results, then they show mainly C3 food sources, which isn't surprising, since all the recovered food plants at the site and the majority of the natural vegetation in the area are C3 plants. The small ranges of carbon values in both tooth appetite and bone collagen indicate that the majority of the population consumed isotopically similar carbon sources, and the results are in line with plants that have been analyzed, recovered archaeologically. The nitrogen results indicate that the population as a whole had regular access to animal protein, which also isn't surprising. The only statistically significant difference among the population in nitrogen results is between adult males and females, with males being higher than females, indicating that adult males had greater access to animal protein in the form of meat and/or secondary products such as milk. In particular, ALA21, an adult male, has the highest measured nitrogen value of the entire analyzed population. You see him here as an extreme outlier all the way at the top of that graph. So if we now circle back to a few of the outliers we've mentioned, it's clear that we're able to reconstruct their lives in some detail. Let's take ALA110, that individual with the lowest strontium value. This male was descended from local populations, as we see from his DNA results, and consumed food throughout his life that was isotopically similar to the rest of Atchana's population. He spent his childhood well outside the Amuk, though in an area that had similar oxygen values to the valley, and moved to Alalakh in his later childhood. He lived a long life, dying between the ages of 65 and 75, and was buried in the Area 3 cemetery with no grave goods, in a manner that is archaeologically indistinguishable from the rest of the burials there. The well lady is a genetic outlier who descended from populations originating well to the east and north of Alalakh, though she seems to have grown up at or very near Alalakh and consumed both food and water with similar isotopic sources to the rest of the Atchana sample throughout her life. She was in her 40s when she died, and her skeleton showed heavy degenerative joint disease and well-healed fractures to her ribs and skull, all indicative of a life with hard physical labor. She wasn't buried at all, really, but was instead thrown face down into a well, a possible victim of murder. Ala 98, one of the other strontium non-locals, spent their entire childhood and youth outside of the Amuk, based on the 2 molars that we sampled, though again, in an area with similar oxygen values and consuming similar carbon sources. Unlike Ala 110, though, their remains were selected for secondary treatment after their death. They were buried secondarily in the Area 3 cemetery in what we might call a mandible burial, a group of 3 mandibles buried together with no other skeletal elements recovered from the grave cut. The other two individuals in this burial are also interesting. One of them, Ala 48, came from the Amuk, but outside of Alalakh, although once more, their oxygen and carbon results are consistent with the rest of the sample. The separation between their M2 and M3 values suggests that they may have moved to a different place in the Amuk between their childhood and adolescence. The last individual, Ala 99, also grew up outside of Alalakh, somewhere in the Amuk, though we were only able to sample 1 molar from this individual. Though their oxygen and carbon results are also similar to the rest of the population, based on their strontium results, all 3 of these individuals came from different places, both within and outside of the valley. Unfortunately, we have no DNA results for any of these individuals since the DNA sampling targeted petrous bones, which of course aren't present in this mandible burial. And mandibles by themselves don't provide much bone to sample for aDNA. Despite their different origins, though, they, or rather parts of them, ended up buried together at Alalakh. Comparing all of these analyses to the burial practices generally, what we see is that the only burial practice that can be associated with non-locals, as identified with strontium, is secondary burial. Of the 5 secondary burials sampled, 4 of them were non-local to Alalakh, coming from either the Amuk Valley or from other areas entirely. And 2 of the 5 non-locals identified were subject to secondary burial practices. It is difficult to securely identify deliberate secondary burials in the context of the Area 3 cemetery, given the high degree of disturbance, both in ancient times caused by the continuous digging of graves in this much used area, and also post-depositionally, since this area is on the slope of the mound and has suffered from slope wash and other more modern disturbances. At a minimum, however, 11 deliberate secondarily treated burials can be identified with a fairly high degree of confidence, which is clearly a minority of burials as a whole at the site. Most of these consist of only skulls and/or mandibles, and all except one of these consist of 2 or 3 skulls or mandibles buried in a group, usually with no grave goods, although a few have a single ceramic vessel of types that are common in the primary burials. So how to explain this correlation of non-locals and this clearly minority burial treatment? These individuals may have been subject to secondary burial treatments because this was a stronger tradition in their homelands, and their families buried them in this traditional way, although secondary burial was not common at Alalakh itself. This explanation would indicate that secondary burial was, in some way at least, culturally linked and expressed some kind of cultural identity, materializing ties with their home settlements. However, due to the nature of secondary burial, it's also possible that only parts of them were buried at Alalakh, and the rest of their remains were transferred back to their homes for disposal. Or vice versa, that they didn't die at Alalakh, and that parts of them were brought there for burial after their deaths. Ala 98, one of the individuals in the mandible burial, I highlighted, which you can see a photo of here, might be an example of this. They spent their entire childhood and youth outside of the Amuk based on the strontium results. And therefore, this part of them could have been transported to Alalakh specifically for burial after their death. In other words, this person may never have set foot in Alalakh while they were alive. The reasons for this type of practice could have had to do with status, or perhaps political elites who wanted to associate themselves with the regional power center, or it could have had religious motivations, since Alalakh was a major cult center, as two possible suggestions, both of which would also tie in with identities and their expression through burial practices. With all of these data sets together, we're able to better understand how people at Alalakh moved across the landscape. Through the strontium and DNA results in particular, we can trace complex mobility patterns across multiple scales. Importantly, we've detected and defined multiple types of mobility. Long-distance migrants, like the ancestors of the well lady, who likely came from Iran or Central Asia, were apparently rather rare, at least based on the data available. Regional migration from the larger Amuk Ebla area was apparently more common. This kind of regional migration is represented in our data set by the non-locals identified through strontium isotope analysis, whose genetic profiles match those of the local inhabitants. There are two possible explanations for this group. They could have come to Alalakh from outside the Amuk, but still within this wider Alalakh Ebla area, where we see this very similar genetic profile. Perhaps from Ebla itself or from the lands around it, for example. The other possibility is backwards migration, meaning that their parents or their grandparents could have moved away from the Amuk, and they then returned to their parents' home later in their lives. Given the relatively low numbers of non-locals identified by strontium isotopes, this type of migration was also apparently not extremely common, though more so than long-distance migration. Short distance or micro-regional migration is also detectable, since we were able to distinguish a local range for Atchana versus one for the Amuk. This type of migration was more common than the others, unsurprisingly, and relatively higher numbers of individuals came to Alalakh from other places in the Amuk. Interestingly, what we don't have evidence for is what we might call transplants. That is, genetic outliers who are also strontium non-locals. The migrating ancestors of the well lady would presumably belong to this category if they were buried at Atchana. So we can't say that this type of people and this type of mobility didn't exist, but we don't currently have any evidence for it. Is this a question of sampling, of preservation, the vagaries of archaeological discovery? That is, have we simply not found or sampled any individuals who would fit into this group? Based on the results we do have, it seems likely that these individuals were relatively rare, but there could be an entire cemetery of, for example, people with genetic profiles that match the well ladies that we just haven't found yet. She presumably was not the only person living in the city with her genetic ancestry. At a bare minimum, she had parents. So this missing group could be, at least in part, due to chance, but it could also be related to cultural practices and ideas. If, as I mentioned regarding the secondary burials, it was common practice to bring people home after their death, if they had been living somewhere else, then that would obscure our ability to see these people, at least using these methods. The last example I want to highlight that the aDNA and isotopic data helps us unravel is the plastered tomb. This constructed tomb is the most elaborate and richest grave found at the site to date, and it contains 4 individuals encased in plaster and arranged in 2 layers, one on top of the other. The tomb itself is located in the Area 3 cemetery on the northern edge of the mound, and it was a particular target for sampling in this project due to its unusual nature. So we have isotopic data for all 4 of the individuals and aDNA data for 3 of them. The 4th individual was also sampled for DNA, but unfortunately, it was not well preserved enough to analyze. Before I talk about the results, though, I want to run through how the tomb was built to give a better idea of how unique this tomb really is. So the first step was the preparation of a bed of cobblestones and pithos fragments that was then covered in white plaster, and this served as the base of the structure. Onto this prepared bed was set the body of an adult male, Ala 40 to 45 years old at death, deposited on his back with his head propped up on a large jar and with his legs flexed to the side. He had a thick piece of plaster inserted into his mouth, which you can see on this photo. With him were found the bones of an adult female, Ala 3, also 40 to 45 years old at death. Her skeleton was disarticulated, though. Her skull was placed at his pelvis, as you can see here, and many of the rest of her bones were stacked to the side of the man's body. It's possible that she was deposited first and that the grave was reopened for the deposition of the man, and that her at least partially skeletonized remains were reorganized at this time, though she may also have been buried elsewhere at first and then redeposited in this tomb when it was built. Many grave goods were placed with these two individuals, although it's not possible in most cases to determine which one they should be associated with, if indeed such a separation was made by the people who built the tomb. A gold ring and pieces of gold foil that may have been hair rings, a handful of pins made of silver and copper alloy, beads of vitreous materials, carnelian, amber, and bone, and various ceramic vessels, including 2 Cypriot base ring jugs, were found in this layer, as well as several gold foil appliques stamped with rosette designs arranged around the man's chest and pelvis that were presumably sewn onto some kind of cloth or clothing. These two individuals were then sealed with a thin layer of plaster shaped into a concave bed on its upper side. On top of this plaster layer, a young adult male, Ala 2, was laid, again, more or less placed on his back with his legs flexed to the side. A vertical bone was found in his mouth, as well as an in situ necklace of alternating gold, carnelian, and vitreous white beads. Copper alloy pins were found in the area of his chest, as well as more of the same type of stamped gold appliques. Another layer of plaster was applied over this young male, and then the final individual was deposited, another adult woman, Ala 38, who died at the age of 35 to 45. This woman was placed in the opposite direction to the others, but unfortunately, her remains were poorly preserved due to proximity to the surface and some post-depositional disturbance to this topmost layer. She also had copper alloy pins in the area of her thorax, as well as beads of amber, gold, and stone, in addition to a rare iron bead. Also found in this upper layer, although again, it's not necessarily clear which of the two individuals they should be associated with, were a bone pin, 2 clay pellets, and several more ceramic vessels. The entire tomb was then sealed by a final layer of plaster that apparently curved around a barrel vaulted coffin based on the wood grain impressions that were preserved on the inside of it. A superstructure made of mud brick seems to have been constructed, but due to post-depositional disturbance, was only preserved in the form of 2 columns of mud brick, bolstering both ends of the tomb. It's not clear if this was a superstructure designed to be visible, or if it served as more of a practical measure to keep the tomb from collapsing. If part or all of the tomb was above ground, its placement at the edge of the mound and the striking white color of the plaster that encased it would have ensured that it was visible from a distance when approaching the city from the north. This is just one of the lingering questions about this tomb. Although the general order of interments is clear based on the archaeological evidence, the number of separate interments and the time interval between them, if one existed, is not clear. There could have been between 1 and up to 4 separate events. In addition to the questions that the disarticulated state of Ala 3 raises about the timing and location of her initial burial, it's not clear whether the 2 layers were built separately as 2 distinct events or together as a single tomb. So looking at the DNA can give us some more information. Stratigraphically, the tomb belongs to period 4 at Alalakh, which matches the grave goods, both placing it in the 15th century BC. Since it's routine practice to do radiocarbon dating when DNA analysis is successful, we have C14 dates from 3 of the individuals, Ala 1, Ala 2, and Ala 38. Ala 3, the woman found disarticulated in the bottom layer, is the one where the DNA analysis was unfortunately unsuccessful. The radiocarbon dates all confirm the archaeological dating sometime around the 15th century BC. We also know from the DNA analysis that ALA 1 and 38 are first-degree relatives, so parent-child or siblings. And we know that both of these individuals, ALA 1 and 38, are second-degree relatives of ALA 2. So this could be an aunt-uncle and niece-nephew, grandparent-grandchild, or half-siblings. When we combine all of this, including the C14 dates, with the osteological data on age and with the order of interments, we can propose this family tree. ALA 1, who died in his 40s and was buried in the bottom layer, was the father of ALA 38, who died in her 30s or 40s and was buried in the top layer. They both seem to have died in the first half of the 15th century, based on the overlap in their C14 dates. ALA 2, the young man buried in the top layer, a second-degree relative to both of them, seems to have been the grandson of ALA 1 and the nephew of ALA 38, and he may have died either slightly later than the first two or around the same time as ALA 38, since remember, he was deposited under her. Probably sometime during the first decades of the second half of the 15th century BC. This clearly then was the family tomb. And although we don't have DNA data for ALA 3, we can speculate that she was also a member of this family. Indeed, Roula Shafik has identified non-metric skeletal traits for this individual that indicate that she may be genetically related to the others. It's possible, given that she may have been the first of these individuals to die, based on the disarticulated state of her remains, and that she was in her 40s when she died, that she belonged to a previous generation, not shown here on the family tree. The mother of ALA 1, maybe, perhaps his sister. This is speculation for the moment, and there are other possibilities that we can't distinguish yet, though, of course. If we look at the isotopic results for these four individuals, nothing stands out about them or marks them as different from the rest of the sampled population. You can see here on the strontium results that they fall within the local Alalakh range, and the same is true for oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. All the results mark them as local, with all of them falling within what would be considered normal population variation. This isn't necessarily surprising. This tomb is unique and clearly special, probably expressing an elite identity. So if this family was part of the city's elite, then it would make sense that they were locals. On the whole, aspects of identity don't align very well with the isotopic and DNA results, and there are no clear correlations, except for secondary burials, the reasons for which are certainly suggestive of some kind of identity, though this can't yet be confirmed definitively. This isn't to say that isotopes can't get at these questions, but just that they don't in this particular case. The dietary differences based on age and sex are apparent. Other variables don't seem to map onto or correlate with distinct diets. Through the strontium and DNA results in particular, we're able to trace complex mobility patterns across multiple scales, from regional and small scale migration within both the Alalakh Abla area and the Amuk Valley. But apart from the ancestors of the well lady, there's little evidence for long distance migration. But it's important to keep in mind that there's much these results can obscure, or which they're not well suited to revealing. Isotopically similar diets doesn't mean, of course, that there weren't differences in what people ate, just that those things had similar isotopic signatures. Diets among different portions of the population could have been very different, but if the isotopic sources of those diets were similar, then those differences wouldn't be visible to us in these results. Similarly, long-distance migration may have been a much more common occurrence, but if it was restricted to adulthood and was temporary, with people returning to their homes either later in life or after death for burial, then it also would not be visible with these methods. This doesn't mean that identity was not expressed through funerary rituals at Alalakh, and there are other indications in the burial corpus, the details of which I haven't really gone into today, that different facets of identity were marked in these rituals. As a couple brief examples, different age and sex groups are associated with different grave goods, with infants and children, adult females and adult males, more commonly receiving specific ceramic vessel types, such as piriform juglets and shoulder goblets, associated with adult females and adult males, respectively. This suggests that these vessels may have had special meanings for these different groups, perhaps holding different types of oils worn in life or used in funerary rituals, or containing specific beverages associated with different groups. We also see particular types of jewelry associated with different age and sex groups, with adult females almost exclusively being given pins, especially toggle pins, and infants and children being given a plainer form of pin, the scroll head pin. This suggests that different groups were dressed differently for death in preparation for funerary rituals, and perhaps also in life, if the personal adornments recovered in graves were personal possessions that an individual wore during their lifetime. However, many aspects of identity do not seem to have been expressed primarily through burial practices in ways that are visible, either isotopically or genetically, with the exception of the choice of secondary burial treatments as revealed by the strontium isotopes. Some aspects of identity thus do remain elusive in the study of the burials at Tell Atchana, though others are more clearly expressed. What these results do reveal, though, are aspects of the life histories of some of these ancient people. Through the intersections of these various methods and analyses, we can zoom in on individuals and begin to understand more about what their lives were like and what experiences they may have had. Some of the individuals I've highlighted here, the well lady, the 3 non-locals in one of the mandible burials, have been revealed to us in different ways through studies like this, which have great potential to teach us more about what life was like in the past, even though there are also limitations to these methods, and we are left with lingering questions for future investigation. So thank you, everyone, for your attention today. I'd like to thank again all my partners in this work, and once more, the organizers for their kind invitation. And I'm happy to take any questions or discuss anything further. Let me perhaps stop sharing my screen. If I can find my mouse. Oh, my